Okay, well, let's get started, everyone. Looks like we have a nice turnout here. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Stefaan Verhulst, who is the co-founder of the GovLab here at NYU. And in the last two seminars, we heard from entrepreneurs participating in GovLab's City Incubator. And now we have the privilege to hear from the co-founder behind this effort. The GovLab is a center focused on improving decision-making using data and the technology surrounding data and collective intelligence. Dr. Verhulst holds many important and commendable positions. He is the editor-in-chief of Data and Policy. He is the research director of the MacArthur Research Network on Open Governance. He is the chair of the Data for Children Collaborative with UNICEF. He is a member of the high-level expert group to the European Commission on business to government data sharing, and of the expert group to Eurostat on using private sector data for official statistics. In 2018, he was recognized as one of the 10 most influential academics in digital government globally by the global policy platform Apolitical. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Verhulst, who will talk to us today about the third wave of open data.
Great, thanks so much, Jackie, and thanks, Chara Lampos, for the invitation. Delighted to be here and delighted to take stock on where we are with regard to open data, and more importantly, where we need to go in order to accelerate the impact of open data across society. And as Jackie indeed alluded to, the last 2 weeks, we've been fortunate to have used this opportunity, this webinar, to feature some of the work that we are initiating, or more importantly, supporting among the City Incubator participants that we have set up at GovLab. And I thought it might be good to, now that you've heard from the field, to perhaps take it to the next level and really reflect on where are we and what are those kinds of examples that we've seen, what are the manifestations of in how open data is being used and how the field is evolving. And so with that, let me try to share my screen for a small slide deck, and that's not it. And the idea is to, there we go. There we go. I already embarrassed myself before I started. And the idea is to really, anyway, touch on a few trends and then engage with everyone who is joining today. And again, thanks everyone for joining and showing up here. So, but let me first start with a lot of the rationales at why we are focusing on open data and why at GovLab we are working on tackling access and reuse of data. And I think it's fair to say that current situation of digitalization, or what some call the digital transformation, that one of the real assets that has been generated from that is obviously data, or the whole phenomenon of datafication, i.e. the fact that whatever we do, every transaction we undertake, there is a data trail, and life and our bodies are being quantified as a result of digital transformation, or the way data or records are being taken. Now, we can have a whole discussion about the challenges, and of course there's no shortage of concerns about the creation of a surveillance capitalism, but at the same time, this data provides for a great opportunity to become more evidence-based as we are developing policies, to become more insightful as we are identifying and solving public problems, and of course, also dealing with urban challenges, which is of course the whole idea behind CUSP on how we can actually use data and other technologies to improve the well-being of citizens within a city kind of context. Now, there's only one big problem, is that the supply of data, that of course has massively increased, and there's no shortage of hyperbolic discussions about the concept of big data. But obviously the supply of data is quite often not met, or is quite often not available to actually the demand for data, especially the demand for using data in the public interest. And so in addition to the concern for misuse, we actually have also a concern about misuses of the data that could, if we find a way to match demand and supply, could actually improve people's lives, because we would have access to data that we never had before. But unfortunately, we see that we have actually a data asymmetry instead of a access to all the data that is being collected and made available in a responsible way. So our rationale and our starting position quite often at GovLab is that many of the data assets that are useful for today's problems are quite often already collected, right? We don't need to actually collect a lot more data. Unfortunately, they are locked away. And so how do we as a society try to unlock those data assets, provide access to those data assets in order to be able to reuse the data for public interest purposes that can improve the well-being of our communities, the well-being of our cities. And that's basically one of the starting rationales behind a lot of the work we do at GovLab, which is, yes, it's very important to prevent misuse. It's also important to prevent misuses, and that will require tackling data asymmetries that are currently existing in societies. And those data asymmetries are not only present among the private sector, because obviously a lot of the data that is being collected resides within the private sector. It's also, of course, present in the public sector. And it is also present in other areas where data is being generated, such as, for instance, even research communities as well. And so for the last few years, we've tried to really develop a whole range of initiatives that can tackle the data asymmetries. And one of the latest initiatives is called the Open Data Policy Lab, which is an initiative that we are developing together with a range of actors, including Microsoft, but also a range of public actors, such as the ones that you have heard of the last 2 weeks, in order to really unlock data and to innovate in how we unlock data in a responsible, systematic, and also sustainable way. And that's what I would like to focus on. Now, obviously, this is not new, and we've tried unlocking data already for quite a while, meaning the whole open data movement is definitely more than a decade old. And before that, we obviously had also a movement to unlock data within government as a result of, for instance, freedom of information legislation or efforts to unlock certain kinds of data assets that government is collecting. Despite the fact that we've had for now more than a decade experiences and efforts in order to unlock data under the rubric of open data, we actually have not yet fully, of course, untackled and dealt with the data asymmetries. And that's why we feel that in order to really make progress and provide access to data in a more sustainable, responsible, and systematic way, we need to build upon the previous waves of freedom of information and open government data and really initiate a third wave of open data. And that's what I will focus on. What are the initiatives and what are the characteristics of that third wave of open data that we need to take into account? And that's the effort that we have initiated now for the last 2 years. It was started off in the summer of 2020, where we had a large consultation with key stakeholders in the open data community to really take stock on where are we with regard to open data and where do we need to go. And that all led to our report that is available at the Open Data Policy Lab as well. And the essence of the report and the essence of the third wave of open data is basically illustrated here, by which we are advocating and also noticing that in order to make advances in the open data space, we really need to focus on 4 core elements where we need to accelerate and advance access to open data. The first one is really publish with purpose. And I will explain more what we mean by that. But I think it suffices to say is that a lot of the initial open data efforts were really about making data available, but quite often not having a good understanding what the use cases or what the potential might be of the data. And as a result, and that was, by the way, the value proposition quite often, right? Some were talking about the long tail of open data, right? Where you actually put data open and then you assume that people will come and actually identify use cases for the data that has been made available. In many cases that has happened, but it also has meant that actually the value of the data was limited in the, only for those that could identify the use cases, and quite often the data for a particular kind of use cases was not made available. So we feel that in addition to open by default, we really need to go and focus more on publish with purpose, as is now kind of well established. The second area is that we need to go beyond the open data portal and really start thinking about data collaboratives or data partnerships, where you bring data together with the demand side and with those that can generate insights. We also need to put data responsibility at the core of open data, because clearly there have been concerns about what data has been available, and more importantly, if we are accessing other data sets that are personally identifiable, for instance, and that are privately held, we really need to innovate also in how we go about using the data in a responsible way, in a way that resonates with people's expectation. And lastly, while we've seen a lot of advances in open data at the national level, and quite often even at the international level, we feel that the next frontier of open data, where actually quite often the biggest value can be generated as well, is at the subnational level, or to connect the subnational level with the national and the local and the international level as well. So that's the punchline, which I already shared in advance, that these are really the 4 characteristics of what we believe the third wave should be, but also of course, this is not based upon some kind of wishful thinking. We also see that actually more and more activities in those 4 areas are happening, which also means that actually we are entering that third wave of open data as we speak. Now, before I go into further detail about what the and how those manifestations of the third wave are currently being developed, and more importantly, of course, I will mainly focus on what we at GovLab are trying to establish in order to advance the third wave as well, together with a whole range of partners, and some of those partners are also on today's call. As I see, it might be important to actually take stock of what are the third waves if we are talking about the third wave, and what were their characteristics. And again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and we can discuss this at the perhaps later at the Q&A as well, whether this captures, of course, the variety of waves well. But it's clear, and it suffices to say, that the value proposition of the first wave of freedom of information was mainly focused on establishing transparency and accountability of government, right? And it's still there. And then I do, anyway, want to make sure that by identifying those 3 waves, that I make sure that you don't assume that those waves are not important and that they still are needed, right? The second wave, of course, which was really about open government data, there we saw an extension of transparency. But again, the transparency and accountability narrative is still very much associated quite often with open data. But we saw an extension in the whole area of reusing data for other purposes, especially problem solving, but also, anyway, we've done a lot of work on economic creation of new companies and the like. Now, what we see in the third wave is really the fact that we are moving more and more beyond just transparency, but also transforming government and transforming the way we go about making decisions, making them more evidence-based, right? And so that's where we see the third wave is not just about transparency, it's also about actually improving the way we make decisions based upon the data that is available in society or could be made available. And we see also that a lot of the focus is more and more on innovation and entrepreneurship, including public entrepreneurship. And again, the presentations that in the previous 2 weeks you all have benefited from were presentations by people that we call public entrepreneurs, right? People that actually are really looking into how can we start using data for changing the way we go about government or changing the way we go about developing public services. Now, the approach is also different. The first wave was really about data on request, right? Was right to know quite often, or more of a demand, meaning data by upon request, right? The second one was really open by default, where you actually pushed out some data. So instead of pull focused, there was push focused. But what we believe is that it has to be both, right? So you have to actually both a request and both driven by demand, but also anyway, based upon this notion of open by default. And so that's what we call by, and what we see with publish with purpose. And it's less about just pulling, like one-sided pulling or one-sided pushing. It's more about actually establishing partnership models, because I do believe that the next, and that many of the problems in today's society can benefit from data, but they will require a more of a data collaborative approach, not just assuming that by making data available, things will improve. Oops, there we go. Oops, yeah, there we go. The other aspects was that geographical focus, and again, I go quickly here because this is more of a comparison. The freedom of information was quite often national. Open government data was national and international, with, of course, several cities leading here as well. But we see that the third wave really needs to embrace this subnational and local and even community-based kind of open data approaches as well. Audience is also increasing steadily from initially anyway, journalists and lawyers and activists, while, of course, the whole idea of freedom of information is to inform the public. But of course, not everyone is submitting FOIA requests, for instance. And so it's really a limited kind of audience that we have. And then the open data, where we had actually an increase of engagement around data. But what we see with the third wave is that, anyway, the audience is obviously massive if we really start thinking about developing partnerships and really more evidence-based approaches as well. And then risks and policies. I will touch on that in a second, where we, of course, need to just go beyond the risk of sharing data, but also becoming more sophisticated about the risks across the data lifecycle. And the institutional approaches is that what we believe is that the third wave, and I will again elaborate on that later on, really requires a new kind of profession, which we call chief data stewards. And again, I see some people on the call here that are already in that function, or of course have worked with us on establishing that function and thinking about what that means in practice as well. All right, now let me go after this, anyway, hopefully approach with regard to why do we talk about the third wave and what were the previous waves and how are they different from each other. Let me now go a little further into unpacking those four manifestations, and more importantly, reflecting on what we here at GovLab have tried to do in order to advance the third wave. And after that, I will go deeper into also some of the primers that we have developed, and more importantly, some of the areas that we feel we need to make progress on in order to so-called ride the wave moving forward as well. Now, the first one is really about publish with purpose. And so the key here is, how do we actually identify purposes for which we need data for? And especially, how do we identify the purpose for reusing data? Because I think that's a really important aspect that I want to emphasize, is that we are talking here about reusing data that was initially identified, initially collected for one purpose, but now are starting to use it for other purposes, right? And initially, as I said, open government data was put out there, assuming that others would define the purpose. But as we all know, if you build it, will they come? Question mark is quite often answered negatively. And so we need to do a much better job, especially if we also want to unlock other data sets in coming up with the questions that matter. And here at GovLab, we have initiated something called the 100 Questions Initiative, which is based upon my frustration of having worked on data for quite a while. And I was always on those panels, and people were always arguing that they needed to have access to data. And then when I asked them, all right, to what end? What's the purpose for which you need access to data? Then quite often I was, anyway, kind of a poorly defined kind of answer. And so from my point of view, we not only need, of course, data, we actually need to do a lot better as a society in formulating the questions that matter. Quite often, we call that establishing questions literacy in addition to data literacy. And so the 100 Questions Initiative is an effort to actually develop what we call a new science of questions, which is more of a participatory science, where we engage with what we call bilinguals, people that have a domain expertise and a data expertise, and sometimes they are trilinguals because they also have a geographical expertise. They could be experts in their region, for instance, or about their region. But what we hope to do is to engage with those bilinguals in order to source what are the questions that matter, for which we need data, but could have access to data if we find a way to formulate the question well. And so it has multiple stages. We work with partners such as the European Commission. We work with partners such as the Asia Foundation, such as the International Organization for Migration, and so on, across a whole range of domains in which we want to develop the priority questions, and then look into what is the data we need for the questions, as opposed to put data out and hope that the questions will be formulated afterwards. And that has totally changed the narrative. It has also changed the way we actually establish data collaboratives, because it's more intentional as opposed to let's see what happens, which of course has in itself a range of data responsibility risks as well. Again, I can go about that at length. Suffice to say is that if you're interested, you can go and look at the100questions.org, where you will see a whole range of questions that we are currently have formulated, and we are actually just kickstarting, and this might be of interest to perhaps this community here at CUSP. We're just kickstarting a new domain which is focused on urban mobility. What are the questions that matter for urban mobility, for which we need data? And if you're interested, let me know and we can connect you to our latest initiative, which we do together with the Central America Bank here in Latin America. But of course, anyway, we are taking a global perspective as well. Now, the second element is, of course, data collaboratives. And here we have worked the last few years in actually advancing the concept of data collaboratives as a new kind of public-private partnership for which around data, right? Where we bring in different parties together, and especially where we seek to unlock quite often data that cannot be made fully open, right? Because one of the key challenges of the early stage of open data was that the assumption was that all the data needs to be made open, right? And obviously that's still, from my point of view, an essential goal, right? And should remain essential goal. But obviously some data cannot be made fully open for a variety of risks, including, for instance, of course, risks with regard to identifying individuals that are within the data, but also risks from a commercial point of view if you try to have access to privately held data as well. And so we really need to advance data collaboration. Now, what we have done is really try to advance our understanding of the types of data collaborations that are essential for the third wave, and really taking a step back and not assuming that there is only one way of actually unlocking data assets through data collaboratives. There are actually a whole range of options that you need to consider when you establish a data partnership. And the matrix that we typically use is, to what extent, anyway, how open can the data be versus how restricted does it have to be? And then also, to what extent is there need for hand-holding, i.e. for close collaboration? In some cases, it could be a data collaborative where you make the data available, but then it's independently used. In some cases, you really want to have more of a cooperative use and reuse of the data. In other cases, it's more directed, where you actually start with, right, you can only use the data for those purposes, right? And so using those kinds of variables, we've come up with like 6 prototypes, or 6, not prototypes, 6 models of data collaboration. And if you're interested, each of those models has then sub-models, because of course there is no one way of doing that. But it suffices to say that there are, there is more than one way. And so, for instance, what we see and what we have been working towards is the model of research partnerships, right? Where you have access to data, for instance, street data, such as Pecan Street is a data collaborative that is really developing access to environmental data, but also through a research partnership. Or you have more of a public interface, like here in New York, you have Numina that has an API, but of course is a kind of a data collaborative because the API is meant for use by public agencies as well. And then we have data pooling, where you bring in different types of data in order to make sense of it, such as, for instance, open curbs data as well. And then in addition to those 3, we also have, for instance, trusted intermediaries. And again, for those that are interested, this week, the World Economic Forum released a report about trusted intermediaries based upon a working group that I was part of, to really advance our understanding on how can we use intermediaries to provide access to data. Again, here an example at the city level, where Envision Charlotte is providing access to data about environmental impact of real estate and buildings. And then we have, of course, prizes and challenges, which is a kind of data collaborative where data is made available for a particular kind of purposes. And then lastly, which is, of course, the least open, is intelligence sharing, where you don't share any data, but you share the insights from the data. And that in itself could be good enough as well. And as you can see, all of those data collaboratives are active across the spectrum from open to more closed. And I think we really need, as a society, in order to embrace the third wave, really need to become more sophisticated about the variables that determine the level of data collaborative that we need, but also the risks that are associated with it and the costs and benefits of each kind of model. Now, the third aspect of the third wave is really about focusing on subnational. And here we need a lot more experimentation on how we use, for instance, data collaboratives at the local level. What you've heard last week, I guess, was what is happening in New York City with regard to the public-private partnership around data for COVID-19 recovery partnership, which is a typical third wave kind of, I would say, example on how you can access privately held data for COVID recovery. But this is an example that we organized in Santiago de Chile, where we used cell phone data in order to understand urban mobility patterns from a gender perspective. And the question here was, is urban mobility gendered, i.e. do women and men travel differently? Obviously, there were all kinds of assumptions, but no evidence on how that really manifested itself beyond some surveys, for instance. And so what we tried to do here was to really tap into cell phone data, call detail records, in order to see how women and men travel differently. And those kinds of data collaboratives, and that was with Telefonica, those kinds of data collaboratives really need to be developed more. And then the fourth element is really putting data responsibility at the heart and the core of open data. And that assumes and means that we need to take a more data lifecycle approach to the risks of data, starting from what are the risks at the level of collection. And one of those risks, by the way, could be that you don't have the social license to reuse the data that was collected for one purpose, right? Because again, we're talking about reuse of data, and it doesn't mean that you can reuse the data for all the purposes if you don't have that kind of social license. And so that's another kind of responsibility to really establish that. But also, anyway, again, I don't have to elaborate here on what all those risks are, but it suffices to say that it's not just at the sharing stage that we need to be aware of the risks. We actually do need to go a step beyond and look into what are all the risks across the data lifecycle. And in order to inform that, here at GovLab, we've developed a data responsibility journey map where you can actually go and look into the whole data lifecycle when you start working on data collaborations, or when you start looking into releasing open data. You can actually use the data responsibility journey to actually assess what are the risks that I need to be aware of, and how do I then mitigate those as well. But again, that's more of a third wave kind of manifestation, because in the previous waves, we didn't really, while we were concerned about privacy, but we really didn't have the kind of practice on how we go about putting data responsibility at the heart. Now, these are, and again, we can discuss this, whether this resonates with all of you, but these are, from our point of view, really 4 distinctive developments that we didn't have in the previous waves of open data that, anyway, we have been working on in order to really increase access to data in a systematic, sustainable, and responsible way. Now, we not just try to identify those 4 aspects, we also try to then understand what stands in the way in order to actually have the third wave be reality. And so again, we did a whole range of consultations, and of course we did we had already quite extensive experience in some of those areas. And so we identified a few priority areas where we need to make advance and where we need to really invest in as well. And the first one is that in order to write the third wave, i.e. be more intentional, focus on collaborations, and not only on one model, but on a variety of models of collaborations, put data responsibility at the core of the efforts. We actually need to establish a new profession, because in order to do so, you can already imagine that there are X amounts of variables that comes into play to actually determine what is fit and best for purpose, right? Because it's not just do something, it's really thinking about how do we actually develop a data innovation that is fit for purpose. And that requires a really good understanding on how do we formulate the questions, what are the variables that determine a data collaborative, how do we go about mitigating the risks, how do we make this sustainable, how do we ensure that actually people are taking the insights and acting upon it in a responsible way. And so all those questions, right, you cannot assume that data scientists have the responsibility to actually answer all those questions and establish those kinds of processes, which is why we feel like a new kind of profession, which we call the data stewards, are needed. And for the last 2 years, I guess, we've now also been establishing executive courses on establishing that cohort of data stewards worldwide. And this is not just within the public sector, it also is within the private sector, because quite often a data collaborative, for instance, fails or is not established because quite often it's very hard to even know who is actually responsible within a particular kind of organization, public or private, for reusing data. And that's why we need those data stewards as the point of contact, but also the profession that can make data collaboration work. Without it, as I've said on numerous occasions, it's not going to scale. And more importantly, we actually might not see the action, we might not see the third wave become a reality. And of course, it's not just one skill set here. Anyway, and again, if you're interested, you can go to datastewards.net. There's a whole range of competencies that are needed in order to ride the third wave or be a data steward. And it ranges from, of course, traditional competencies of such as stewarding data as it relates to integrity, as it relates to metadata, as it relates to understanding what kind of engineering is needed. But it also involves stewarding partnerships and collaborations, stewarding internal assets, stewarding sustainability, and also, of course, stewarding the insights. And so those are kind of the 5 key competencies that we work on together with our data stewards to make this more of a profession. The other one is, of course, we need to distribute institutional data capacity, and that's the reason why we started the city incubator, is to really incubate and strengthen the capacity within cities on how you ride the third wave, on how you go about thinking about open data in a more kind of collaborative and entrepreneurial approach. And again, happy to talk about that, but I think the last 2 weeks you've heard enough about the city incubator, probably so that I don't have to go again in detail. But the other aspect in order to ride the third wave is that we actually need to become more sophisticated about documenting impact and value. And I always make the bad joke is that we need a lot more data about the use of data in order to advance actually the value proposition behind data. It cannot just be ideological, right? That data is doing good things. We need to really establish that kind of value proposition. And here are just a few examples on what we've been trying to do in order to evaluate the use and reuse of data across society. And it ranges from coming up with a new canvas, such as the one that is listed there in the middle, to ultimately also actually doing use cases and developing logic models to document the value and strengthen the evidence base around data. Did I skip one again? Yeah, we also need new data intermediaries. And again, as I already mentioned, this is the report that came out this week that might be of interest to some on the call here. But also, like we work with a variety of other organizations, and I always point to Sage Bionetworks as like the ideal new kind of intermediary that we need in order to not only research data, but also leverage data moving forward. We also need to establish and innovate a governance. It's remarkable that I always feel like that we've really innovated on how we do analytics. We've innovated on how we unlock data. There are federated systems there, for instance, but we have not really innovated on how we go about governing data quite often. And so we need also a lot more innovation, including we need a lot more engagement with the data subjects in order to build that kind of social license. And so what you see here is the data assembly, which is a citizens assembly that we established here in New York City around the reuse of data during COVID-19. And this is another example that we have tried to innovate at GovLab, which is basically the so-called contractual wheel of data collaboration, where we try to demystify data sharing agreements, because quite often, if you're seeking to have access to data, then surprise, surprise, quite often, you need to get a legal agreement or a contractual arrangement or a license in order to access the data. And that quite often took years, if not longer, to establish. And what we tried to do here was to actually say, well, let's not make it too complicated, but really focus on the core aspects that need to be established for a data sharing arrangement. And that's the Contracts for Data Collaboration initiative, where we try to innovate. We also turn this now in a smart contract with some law firms as well. We also, of course, need to advance issues with regard to access to data from a technical point of view, including preparation, such as differential privacy, but also, of course, sharing, such as, for instance, federated and distributed data sharing. We also need to strengthen public data competencies and, of course, question competencies. And of course, that's why every year we are delighted to work with our colleagues here at Open Data Week, which is coming up in March. But I think we need a lot more public conversation about the use of what the third wave of open data can mean. We also need to understand more who is actually making decisions and making that more document that. So here we identified the need for decision provenance in addition to data provenance, and developed a tool that can, across the data lifecycle, show what are actually the decisions being made and who makes those decisions, who needs to be engaged around the decisions, and how do we then make that more transparent. So these are the what we believe 8 competencies or 8 areas that we need to advance in order to be able to ride the third wave. And as I said, this is not about assuming that the previous waves are not important, because there's quite often a maturity cycle, of course, that we need to go through, but it's really about we need to advance where we are with regard to accessing data and unlocking data assets if we really want to make data an asset for society and an asset that we can use for the public good, and a way to actually address those data asymmetries, as I mentioned at the beginning. Right, Jackie, that was probably too long from my end and too much of like lecturing as opposed to giving more concrete examples. But anyway, I hope that sets the stage for a discussion on whether that resonates. Also eager to hear from people in the audience. Anyway, what are you doing that resonates and that fits within the third wave as well?
Thank you so much, Stefan. That was really fabulous. We really enjoyed that. And no, it was definitely not too pedantic. I really appreciated the slides. They were just so organized and beautiful. So thank you. Let's open up the floor to some questions or to some comments. Perhaps people want to share either questions or examples like Stefan suggested of how they're working in this area. So you can either put your question in the chat or you can just unmute yourself and start talking.
And it's great to see everyone, by the way.
Great. Well, I'll start off while people are kind of collecting their thoughts. I can start off. Oh, wait, Haralampos has his hand raised. Haralampos, do you have a question?
Go ahead, Jackie.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah, then. So I am curious what you said at the end about federated data. So I know that in the medical machine learning community, people are starting to discuss this idea of federated learning. So with health data, I guess there's very strong privacy issues around people's health records. And so the idea has been proposed, for instance, like, let's say, for instance, you're trying to build a machine learning model to detect COVID or to detect a certain type of cancer. And it would be ideal to have data across different institutions to build a better model. But the problem is that institutions either do not want to or cannot share data for privacy reasons. And so the idea is that you can use neural networks to actually just share the model output instead of the actual input to the data. And so I was wondering, but then I guess I've heard some people criticize that idea because they say, well, how can you trust the model? How do you know people aren't lying to you if the data itself isn't transparent then? And so I just thought I would just ask you if this is something that's being talked about in your field outside of the medical field, and what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Jackie. And again, it's a big topic and again, a lively topic, as you rightly said, but it is also a topic that I put that under the rubric of an example of data collaboration, right? Where indeed, quite often you don't, anyway. And by the way, it's also a topic that really has strengthened the argument that we not only that we sometimes don't always have to assume when we talk about open data that it automatically means data sharing, i.e. transfer of data, right? And so we have many more options now where data quite often doesn't have to transfer, right? But where you actually bring the algorithm to the data as opposed to the data to the algorithm, for instance. And there are anyway a whole range of initiatives that we collaborated with. One is, for instance, called Opal, which was developed by MIT, Sandy Pentland, and DataPop, for instance. And the whole idea here was to use federated learning in order to access cell phone data, right? And so it was developed in the context of, initially developed in the context of one data collaborative, which was the data development collaborative that was initiated by Orange, which is, of course, the French telecom, one of the French telecom operators. And the idea here was that how can we actually, anyway, provide access to the data without compromising the data. And so they developed Opal, which was basically like a federated way to test out algorithms and things. Now, clearly, that requires, right, a new kind of auditing. As you rightly said, Jackie, it's not just about auditing the data, it's now auditing the model that was used. And actually, from my point of view, we will require new types of auditors, right, that will be able to then acknowledge that the model was sound and performed according to a set of criteria, right? And I think we have not seen this, partly because, of course, as you know, explainability is quite often a hard challenge as well. But I think that's really where we need to go to. And from my point of view, that's where we need a lot more experimentation as well. But also, by the way, I think federated systems also require a distinctive governance structure. And too often the discussion about federation is mainly focused on the technology, not on the governance. And it's interesting that Opal, for instance, actually initially was a technical effort, has more and more become a governance effort, right? It's less of actually about technology, it's more about how do you govern access to data and what's then the role of a technology like Opal, for instance, to use it for.
Well, that's great. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to hog this question, but I just have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Which is that, like, you know, so with, yeah, so the federated learning, yeah, the cell phone data is where that started. So thanks for bringing that up. And in the case of cell phone data, it's like particularly difficult with privacy issues, because even if you make the individual anonymous, right, the topic of the conversation could still be, you know, pinned back to that individual. With health records, my question is, well, why can't you just make it anonymous and then it's fine? Because I don't think you can then pin it back so easily to the individual. Or maybe you can, I don't know. But it seems that, like, maybe this also has to do with the life cycle of the data, and yeah, and also, like, if you can maybe before the data is even collected, set up certain you know, privacy forms that people sign to say, okay, I'm going to allow this data to. And so I was just wondering if that's, like, also part of the life cycle initiative to kind of, in the data collection process, to make it set up in such a way that it can be used later for reuse, and to, like, be thinking about the issues there.
Yeah, and again, Jackie, that's a big topic, but and there's a whole conversation about, anyway, to what extent can one anonymize, and to what extent, anyway, is re-identification anyway, a risk? And the question is, of course, is it a risk worth taking, which is then toward what end? Which is why you can quite often not separate those discussions with actually the purpose for which you need to have access for, right? And that's also quite often, like, for instance, as you mentioned, if you would have a social license at the beginning for using the data for a particular kind of purposes, you would have a different kind of expectation on how the data is being used, as opposed to, anyway, not having that kind of social license, right? Or not having that kind of understanding that it actually might be reused for certain kinds of purposes. So it's a lot of it is exactly a design question. But I think you mentioned also a real important issue is that we shouldn't assume, right? Quite often there's a lot of discussion in the economic literature about, data is great because it can be reused at no cost. And so it's a real asset. We shouldn't assume that making it reusable, right, is easy, right? And indeed, we need to design collection of data in a far more better way so that it actually can be extracted in a reusable manner more easily down the line and for the purposes that we care about as well.
Thank you so much. So Haralampos, do you want to ask your question now? Haralampos, I think you're muted. Do you want to ask your question? Not sure if he hears us. So I will open up the floor to any other questions that we have. Oh, Haralampos, are you ready to ask your question?
I see we have a couple of comments in the chat. One of them is by.
Yeah, I just saw the chat just came up, but I don't know if you heard us. I was asking if you wanted to ask your question.
Oh, sorry, disconnected. Let's go through the chat first, and
Okay.
if there is time, I can
Okay,
ask.
yeah, we just got some questions. So Bernard asked, data collaboratives, could you elaborate a bit more on the comparison between data pooling and prizes and challenges? What do you think about the economical challenges?
Yeah, well, meaning obviously they are somewhat distinctive in the sense, but again, there are all kinds of hybrids that you could think of as well, right? So there's as I said, there are models that can be combined. But obviously data pooling is quite often where you have a set of actors that are agreeing to pool the data together, right? And quite often this is based upon a concept of what is generally known as a club good concept, right? So where you basically create a club, as said, where you limit access to the data to those that have shared the data. That's one model of data pooling. And then, of course, the key is, of course, what's the membership role? What's the membership structure? What's the level of reciprocity, i.e. what do we get out of it? Because data pooling is quite often based upon a notion of reciprocity, right? And you see a lot of that in the clinical, you mentioned, Jackie, the healthcare space. You see a lot of that in clinical and the pharmaceutical kind of spaces where they pool the data because they know that by actually combining it, you get better insight that benefits everyone. And especially this is quite often happening in a pre-competitive environment, right? So that you actually generate insight that is pre-competitive. And prizes and challenges quite often is more about really experimenting with what can you do with the data, right? And that we haven't, that we didn't anticipate. I mean, these are all the datatons or hackathons quite often that we see as well. But of course, it's also about how do we actually develop models that then can be repurposed for, in other kinds of contexts. And so that's the distinction. I'm not sure what is meant by the economical challenges. Is it meant by what's the cost of doing so, or is it was there another element?
Yeah, it's actually the question about the costs and
grossly, yeah.
Often you have it's really the aspect of the costs and who will initiate such a collaboration or a hackathon or whatever it is, and what is then the initial, let's say, incentive to spend some budget. I mean, if it's a small thing, it's easier, but if you're looking for a bigger collaboration, it can be quite difficult. Also, this reciprocity. I mean, I attended some workshop in the context of smart mobility, and it seemed to me that's quite difficult to get a working reciprocity to get real value out of the data.
Right. Yeah, no, it's exactly. And that's why it's really, when you develop those kinds of initiatives, it's really important to reflect on the incentives, right? Because as I mentioned, a key element of data stewardship is thinking about sustainability. There's no shortage of pilots, right? Let's do something quickly. but then what are the incentives to keep it going, or what are the incentives, especially if you have prizes and challenges, to even participate, right? Because especially it's not only a cost for those that provide data, there's a cost for those that are actually spending time on generating insight from the data as well, and what's their return down the line, right? And I think all of these are design questions from my point of view that we really need to take into account. And we also, to answer your, to be blunt, Bernard, there is no really good accounting mechanism to measure the cost of those kinds of efforts, right? I mean, quite often people start without really understanding what does it take to develop a good data pool, or what does it take to actually develop a good data challenge, for instance. And that's one of the areas that I feel under data stewardship, we need a profession to not only understand, for instance, responsibility, but also sustainability, right? So what are actually the cost benefits that come out of that? And it's not well developed.
Okay, wonderful. So Atanu has another question in the chat. Do you see the initiatives in the data ecosystem that can address some of the connectivity areas and data sovereignty?
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of discussion about data sovereignty, but one assumption of data sovereignty is, of course, that you have some level of sovereignty about the data that comprises either yourself or your organization, or in some context, your region, right? So there's like the whole discussion about European data sovereignty, but you also have individual data sovereignty discussions about, this is my data, I should be the sovereign of my data. And I think it all fits me. We just started an initiative as well. And again, those that are interested, eager to have everyone join. We just started a new international network around International Network for Digital Self-Determination, which is linked with this notion of sovereignty, but more focused on actually empowering the data subject, or empowering those that are concerned about the use of data, such as communities, such as, for instance, indigenous groups, right? To what extent can they be empowered to determine how data about them is being used, right? And so it's less about full control, right? Which is quite often the data sovereignty discussions quite often ends up with, if we need control, and then from a technical point of view, we need a data vault, and we can only provide access to those in the vault upon certain kinds of conditions. It's more about determination, and how do we go about actually determining the conditions without fully controlling, because that turns out to be desirable quite often, but very hard to establish. And so it's quite often binary. It's either or, everything or nothing. And it's really about self-determination that we need to start looking towards. And I think, anyway, that's my answer. I'm not sure whether that's Atanu, whether that resonates with you.
Since there seems to be radio silence, this is a Yuri Paraschek. You may ask a question, Stefan.
Sure.
First of all, Stefan.
I'm so sorry, I was on mute. I was calling on you just now.
No problem.
Sorry about that. Okay.
First of all, Stefan, I want to say thank you very much for the newsletter that you send every week. That's a ton of work, and I can't imagine, and I find some surprising things in there all the time. So thank you very much for that.
Pleasure, pleasure.
The second thing is that if you kind of look at the ethical ways in which you're talking about data, the completely unethical ways in which Google absconds with data, you know, you would have to, they've gone so far in acquiring all of that data that to try to control through any kind of sovereignty has to be a really difficult issue, I imagine. I mean, is there a technical infrastructure? I suppose there is, that you could put in place that would only allow you to do certain kinds of processing, but then that would have to create all kinds of protocols and systems. I think the cat's out of the bloody bag right now, and I don't know what we can do anymore.
Right.
By the way, you could get put in the chat, get a Pine phone or a Linux phone. It basically runs a Linux desktop on your phone, and you can switch off mechanically GPS and all kinds of things. Anyway, go over to you.
Yeah, no, Jury,
What can we
this is the, thanks for such an easy question. This is the anyway, more than $1 billion kind of question is exactly how do we reestablish a new kind of data ecosystem, right? Which is less asymmetric, right? Which is why I started with this notion of asymmetry, right? Because we see the creation of those kind of data monopolies. And as a result, we see also inside asymmetries, right? And from my point of view, it's a really public good discussion that we need to have about, anyway, how do we make sure that the data that is collected, that it's accessible so that we can actually have more spread of knowledge and insight in a more equal and fair manner as well. And of course, there's no shortage of experimentations on developing so-called personal management, personal data management systems, right, where you control some of the data. But I think the key is going to be how do we actually do this in an ecosystem where more and more data is already collected, and how do we do this in a way that actually allows for a level of self-determination, but also without locking it all up, because the point I wanted to make, it's not just about preventing misuse, it's also about preventing misuses from the data. And quite often, if we don't look at them together, we might actually harm society more than we might benefit it.
Thank you very much. A very cogent response.
So Haralambos, do you want to go ahead and ask your question now, since it doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat?
I can, or we can also wrap it up. What do you think, Jackie?
Well, why don't we just do one more question and then.
Okay,
and then we'll
I'll be very brief. Thank you for the great presentation. I was thinking that sort of the first two waves had to do with accountability and public use of data, and we also have private data that companies and researchers sort of traditionally purchase. So where does the social licensing framework that you described falls sort of within this within this spectrum? Or it doesn't, it's a third data point?
No, I think the social licensing, and again, by social license, I really mean to what extent is there an expectation, but also a clear indication, right, on the conditions under which and the purposes for which the data can be reused, right? And I think that's the reason why I feel like when we talk about open data, we really need to acknowledge that we are talking about reuse of data that was collected for one purpose, and now we start using it for another purpose. And clearly, the scale of reuse and the scale of use cases has massively increased across the three waves, which is why at a certain current point in time, we actually need to really establish a new way of social license beyond consent, right? Because anyway, I'm not saying that we should get rid of consent. You're saying it's not good enough anymore. And we really need to experiment with new ways of doing so, such as, anyway, more citizens' deliberations and so on. Now, it's interesting, the whole concept of social license, as you might know, originated in the mining industry, right? And the whole idea there was, how do we get a social license to extract the asset of what might belong to a community, right? And I think that's the reason why I kind of like it also within the data context, because it has similar kind of connotations that by reusing, you actually extract value, right, from an asset that actually might belong or might be connected with someone else. And I think that's why we need to establish similar kind of efforts to actually build that kind of social expectation, and more importantly, acknowledgement that we shouldn't assume that we have the social license for doing this.
Thank you. That was incredibly fascinating. Dr. Verhulst, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really enjoyed hearing about your work.
Pleasure. Anytime, Jackie. And thanks, Jackie and Charalampos. And thanks, everyone, for joining and spending this hour together. Take care.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.